The town of Cedar Ridge slept beneath a restless wind. Night clung to the mountains like a heavy quilt stitched together by the faint hum of distant turbines. In the valley below, houses sat scattered like forgotten toys, their windows dark, their porches sagging under the weight of time. It was a night so still that even the dogs did not bark, and the only motion came from the slow, relentless spin of the windmill blades. Inside the dispatch center, Naomi Brooks sat alone. Her chair tilted slightly backward as she listened to the endless humming silence of the room. The fluorescent lights above buzzed with a steady, maddening pitch. A mug of coffee cooled beside her untouched for hours. She had worked this shift many times before and knew its rhythms, the predictable calls about car trouble, late-night disputes, or drunken wanderers needing a ride home. But tonight there was nothing. No voices, no sirens, no drama. Naomi tapped a pen on a notepad, tracing absent-minded lines that formed into the shape of a small fox. It reminded her of her son's favorite toy, a tiny flashlight shaped like a fox's head. He had once told her it was magic, that it could chase away bad dreams. The thought brought a faint smile to her lips, but it faded quickly. In Cedar Ridge, bad dreams had a way of slipping into daylight. The phone rang, slicing through the quiet. Sharp, sudden, almost unreal. Naomi straightened headset already in place. 911, she said softly. Nothing answered. Not at first. Just a shallow breath, the kind that sounded like someone was hiding under a blanket, afraid to move. Naomi's hand tightened on her pen. "Hello," she prompted. A pause stretched out impossibly long before a small, fragile voice floated through the line. "Can you bring me a Happy Meal?" Naomi froze. It wasn't a request for help, not really. There was no panic, no sobbing, no frantic shouting in the background. The words were eerily calm, almost rehearsed as if the child had been practicing them for hours. Her mind raced through possibilities: a prank call, a lost cell phone, a game. But there was something in the way the voice trembled at the edges, something she couldn't ignore. "Sweetheart," she asked gently, "where are your mom or dad right now?" Another pause. Naomi counted in her head. 1, 2, 2.4 seconds. Too long for hesitation, too short for distraction. The exact kind of silence that told her someone was holding back words. "They're sleeping," the boy said finally. "They won't wake up." Naomi's pulse quickened. Her pen scratched across the paper. "Sleeping. Won't wake." She glanced at the map board glowing on the far wall. "Can you tell me where you are?" she asked, keeping her voice calm. The boy hesitated, then whispered, "It's the greenhouse, the one with the big tire in the yard." That was all she needed. Naomi's fingers flew over the keyboard, cross-referencing addresses, narrowing down locations. One match appeared: 148 Sycamore Street. She grabbed her radio. Unit 7 and Unit 12 respond immediately to Sycamore Street, possible child in distress. Proceed with caution. Across town, Sergeant Elena Ruiz sat behind the wheel of her cruiser, patrolling the narrow roads on the edge of Cedar Ridge. When Naomi's voice came over the radio, something in her tone made Elena's hands tighten on the steering wheel. Years on the force had taught her to trust Naomi's instincts. Within minutes, Elena and her rookie partner, Mark Hanley, turned onto Sycamore Street. It was darker here, the streetlights broken or flickering weakly. The houses looked tired, worn down by poverty and neglect. There, Mark murmured, pointing. The greenhouse stood at the end of the street, its siding peeling like sunburned skin. A single tire lay tipped over in the yard, half buried in weeds. Elena slowed the cruiser, scanning the shadows. Something moved a truck, maybe idling without headlights 2 blocks away. Then it was gone, swallowed by darkness. A chill ran down her spine. "Stay sharp," she whispered to Mark as they approached the house. The front door was slightly ajar. A sour smell of mildew and something metallic seeped into the humid night. Elena pushed the door open with her foot and stepped inside. The living room was a wreck, trash scattered across the floor, dishes crusted with mold, the couch torn and stained. Two adults slumped motionless against each other on the couch surrounded by pill bottles and empty syringes. Their chests rose and fell shallowly, barely alive. But Elena wasn't looking for them. She was listening for the sound Naomi had described, a small, careful breath. She found it in a back room. A makeshift tent of blankets and chairs stood in the corner. Beneath it, a pair of wide, frightened eyes glimmered in the darkness. The boy clutched a cordless phone so tightly his knuckles were white. His shirt hung loose on his thin frame, his face streaked with dirt. "Hi there," Elena said softly, lowering her weapon. She switched to a smaller flashlight shaped like a fox and set it gently on the floor. "It's safe now." The boy didn't move. He simply stared, unblinking, his breath hitching in shallow bursts. Elena stayed low, keeping her voice warm but steady. "I'm Elena. I'm here to take you somewhere safe." "Okay." Finally, a whisper. "Did you bring the Happy Meal?" The question pierced Elena's heart. It was such a small hope in the middle of so much ruin. "Not yet," she promised. "But we'll get you one, I promise." The boy crawled out slowly as if expecting the world to collapse beneath him. When Elena lifted him into her arms, she was shocked by how light he felt, as if fear had hollowed him out. As they stepped back into the night, the wind caught a loose shutter, slamming it shut with a sharp crack. Somewhere down the street, an engine rumbled to life. Elena turned her head just in time to glimpse a dark shape, perhaps the same truck from before, disappearing around a corner. A man's silhouette, a glint of a leather jacket, and something pale across his throat. A scar, and then it was gone. Naomi's voice came over the radio. "Status." Elena looked down at the boy in her arms. His small fingers clutched the fox-shaped flashlight like a lifeline. "Child recovered," she said. "Alive. We're bringing him home." The word home felt fragile in her mouth, like something she might break if she said it too loud. If you believe in the power of true stories that can change lives, consider subscribing to this channel so you never miss the next story that matters. Morning came to Cedar Ridge like a hush settling over a chapel. The mountains wore a pale band of light, and the wind that had worried the town all night softened to a thoughtful breath. In the small kitchen of Avery and Jonah Patel, sunlight sifted through a curtain stitched with tiny stars and fell onto a round table set for 3. A bowl of cut fruit waited at the center, slices of apple coins, of banana shards, of strawberry, with a neat spoon beside it as if the bowl itself had manners. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon and laundry soap, the kind of scent that implied order without insisting on perfection. They brought the boy home just after dawn. He was quieter than morning itself, small in Jonah's oversized hoodie sleeves pooling at his wrists, the fox-shaped flashlight tucked into the pocket like a traveling lantern. He stood just inside the door, unsure whether to remove his shoes or vanish into the wood grain. Avery did not reach for him. She had learned over years and many children that the first rule of welcome is distance calibrated to the guest. She set a glass of water on the table, slid the fruit a little closer to his side, and moved away, giving the room back to him. Jonah busied himself at the sink, making noise without meaning the honest percussion of a faucet, the soft clink of dishes. Home spelled itself out in a grammar of ordinary sounds. The boy took one step forward, then another. He sat, not quite touching the chair back, as if he were afraid of leaning into comfort. He considered the fruit, chose a piece of apple, and held it for a while before tasting. His face did not change, but something eased in his shoulders, a thread loosened. He reached for the spoon and collected the banana like a careful archivist. They told him their names without ceremony. Avery, who taught art to first graders and knew how to speak in color. Jonah, a wind engineer who could make a turbine pray with balance. The boy offered his own name almost by accident, as if it had slipped and fallen out of his pocket. Theo. He ate until he remembered to stop. Then he folded his hands in his lap and watched the light glide across the table the way a cat might watch its own tail. Avery showed him the room. Not big, not small, just right for a pair of pajamas and a private hope. A little bookshelf crouched beneath the window. On top sat a nightlight, not a fox, but a simple amber bulb under a shade of pale paper soft as a breath. She pointed to a basket of socks, a blanket that smelled faintly of sun. The closet door, which made a round, obliging sound when it closed, no sharp edges, nothing that could slam. Theo stood in the doorway, as if the room might decide about him before he decided about it. He set the foxlight on the dresser and watched it rest there guarding the space, a small and steady sentinel. When Avery left, she did not fully close the door. She let it remain a parenthesis open enough for a voice to travel through if a voice were needed. He napped in pieces like a poem that did not wish to be an essay. He woke at every unfamiliar noise and learned the names of the house by ear, the warm exhale of the heater, the metallic question of the refrigerator, the polite complaint of the floorboards when someone crossed the hall. He mapped them the way a sailor maps a coastline, sound first sight later. In the afternoon, Jonah went into the shed and came back with a toy car, its front wheel loose and chattering. He did not present it as a gift. He set it on the porch rail and pretended to be surprised when the sun illuminated a hairline crack in the axle. He propped the door open and let the work explain itself. Theo wandered outside and stood nearby watching as Jonah disassembled the wheel and coaxed the axle straight. The boy's breath slowed to match the rhythm of turning again. When the wheel finally spun true, Theo reached out and set the car on the porch boards, letting it roll into a neat arc before catching it with his palm. It was not joy exactly, but it was a cousin of joy just arrived for a visit. Evening fell like a page turning. Avery made soup the kind that suggests mercy, a broth that remembered vegetables the way one remembers nursery rhymes. She set Theo's bowl on a folded towel so the ceramic would not clatter against the wood. He ate without hurry. When his spoon touched the bottom, he looked surprised as if a trick of kindness had worked on him. That night he invented a ritual. 3 breaths measured with the foxlight balanced on his knee. 4 points of touch, the bed frame, the nightstand, the edge of the dresser, the door jamb. Then a whispered naming of the people who were allowed to enter the circle he had drawn: Avery, Jonah, Elena, Naomi, though he had never seen her face, only the shape of her listening. He repeated the names until the syllables fit the room, until the room fit him. In the dark, memory returned not as narrative, but as temperature. He remembered the cold that lived inside the walls of the green house, the way the couch breathed a different kind of air, the metallic taste of fear. He could not name the shape in the doorway, but he could name the jacket, heavy leather smelling faintly of oil and winter. He could name the pale thing that lay across the throat beneath the jawline. He could name the quiet of a truck that idled without headlights as if it had learned to wait. He did not cry. He watched the fox glow travel around the room in slow rotations, as if the light itself were a sentry on patrol. In the morning, school came to him like a foreign country with gentle customs. A desk, a pencil that did not wobble, a teacher who said his name with the cadence of a lullaby and did not ask questions that required confessions. During art, Theo sorted markers into the order that made sense to him: cloudleaf, river; sun, berry, plum smoke. The other children made weather with their mouths. Theo made weather with his hands. The days learned him. He ate fruit without counting the pieces. He slept in longer blocks, stitching rest to rest. He sat at the table and followed discussions with his eyes the way one follows birds. He began to hum to himself when he concentrated a sound that resembled a turbine on a gentle day, steady, almost content. The small changes were recorded not with ink, but with silence. At the dispatch center, Naomi pulled the audio of the first call and noticed again the silence between his answers. 2.4 seconds. She played the clip once then, once more, and wrote in the margin of her log train for pauses, not just cries. She thought of the foxlight and of her son, who would have liked the idea that bravery could be a lamp, not a spear. At the CPS office, Brianna Cho loaded a file and frowned at the gaps. 7 months not accounted for in a life that should have been accounted for. She followed the administrative breadcrumbs the way a careful person follows dark water, gently with both hands ready to withdraw if the current shifted. She found an old record in another county, a sealed birth private placement, a girl whose name had changed before it could take root. Brianna did not draw conclusions. She only made a note to ask better questions, the kind that invited the truth to sit down and breathe. Back at the Patel house, danger arrived as a rumor first. Jonah noticed tire tracks in the morning dust that did not belong to them. The camera he had mounted on a whim picked up a shape at the edge of the yard, a vertical weight that might have been a man or might have been a habit of the shadows. In the afternoon, a wrapped candy appeared on the fence post. It looked like innocence and tasted like history. Jonah dropped it into the trash and washed his hands until the past loosened from his skin. Avery felt the air thin the way it thins on high trails when clouds decide to close. That evening, she added a second lock and moved the porch chair slightly so a person would have to make a choice between comfort and concealment. She did not speak the word threat. She spoke the word routine. Children survive on routines the way travelers survive on maps. Elena visited on Thursdays. She arrived with groceries and attention she kept in her back pocket. She listened to the house with the same care Naomi used on a phone line. She stood on the porch with Jonah and watched the street soften into dusk. Elena rarely talked about fear. She counted its footprints. On the second Thursday, she found one, a partial shoe print in the mud beyond the hydrangeas, the heel worn low on one side as if the person carried a lopsided history. She photographed it and said nothing to Theo, who was inside building a paper city in the living room. Its streets aligned to where the sunlight would want to go. For Theo, sanctuary was a collection of small certainties, the way Avery folded towels, the note Jonah left near the sink about changing the water filter the moment the porch light clicked on each evening. He kept the fox light on his dresser during the day and near his pillow at night. When fear came knocking quietly like a salesman ashamed of his pitch, Theo performed his ritual and watched the numbers do their work. 3, 4, names, breath. He did not pray. He rehearsed stability. Some nights he woke to the sound of wind pushing past the wind farm on the ridge, and the sound felt like a kindly hand on a door, rattling it to make sure the latch held. He liked those nights. They meant the mountain was watching with him. Elsewhere, voices moved through offices and hallways. Brianna mentioned to Kendra Alvarez that the past seldom vanishes. It hides in paperwork and comes back as weather. Kendra rubbed her eyes and asked for the full timeline. They spoke in low tones out of a habit of respect toward sleeping children. They used careful words not because a recorder demanded them, but because a conscience did. Naomi stayed late one evening to draft a new training module for dispatch listening for the unsaid, the ethics of silence. She wrote that silence in a child's voice is not emptiness. It is content under pressure. She drew a simple diagram, 2 circles overlapping, one labeled fear of discovery, the other hope for help. The overlap she named courage. She thought about subscribing to a newsletter for first responders that shared case studies, then smiled at the old-fashioned thought. Stories she believed traveled better by mouth than by memo. Spring put a hand on the valley and tilted it toward warmth. Theo learned to feed the hens and return with eggs that wore their own dust. He learned that soap can smell like oranges. He learned that sleep can be a place you visit, not a cliff you fall from. He learned to his awe that some doors open inward. Eventually, the town learned his name without speaking it. A cashier looked a second longer. A neighbor added a second porch light. A stranger picked up a piece of litter and tucked it into a pocket as if removing a single threat from the world might make room for one more breath. At the end of one ordinary day, Theo sat on the porch steps and watched the last light sketch the fence line. Somewhere a truck rolled past without stopping. He felt for a heartbeat, the old quiet, a hollow space that did not belong to him anymore. He put his palm flat on the wood and said the names once carefully. Avery, Jonah, Elena, Naomi. The foxlight waited beside him unlit and still speaking. Behind him, inside the house, Avery placed a small note on the fridge where he would see it in the morning. We are here. We are staying. The words did not announce themselves. They simply occupied the room the way certainty does, lightly, exactly leaving space for air. If this story resonates with you, please consider subscribing so more listeners can find these quiet, life-changing moments. Your support helps this channel continue telling stories that matter. The wind returned with a different voice, restless and high-pitched, rushing over the ridge as if it carried a warning no one wanted to hear. In Cedar Ridge, spring had shifted toward summer too quickly, and the air seemed too thin to hold its own weight. The turbines along the mountainside spun faster than usual, their blades slicing through the dusk like steady mechanical wings. Jonah Patel, standing on the porch, could feel the vibration in his ribs. It was the sound of tension disguised as progress. For several days, an uneasy quiet had settled around the Patel house. It was not the peace of safety, but the brittle calm of a room where everyone is holding their breath. Theo seemed unaware of the danger shadowing him, though sometimes his play betrayed what his words could not. He arranged his paper city on the living room rug, carefully constructing streets that led nowhere, and bridges that connected only to themselves. When Avery asked what he was building, he shrugged almost apologetically and whispered, "Places that can't be found." It began with the letter. No envelope, no return address, just a folded sheet of paper slid under the front door while they slept. Avery discovered it at dawn, a pale shape against the dark wood. She opened it, expecting a flyer or neighborly note. Instead, she found 8 words printed in block letters. "If he talks, the boy disappears. Keep him quiet." Avery stared so long that the words imprinted themselves on her vision. When she handed the paper to Jonah, his face did not change, but the muscles in his jaw hardened. He placed the note in a Ziploc bag and tucked it into a drawer. Then he checked every window lock twice, and 3 times his movements clipped and deliberate like stitches closing a wound. When Elena Ruiz arrived that afternoon, she read the note once and said nothing for a moment. Her silence was heavier than words. She bagged it carefully and slipped it into her jacket for evidence. Then she stepped out onto the porch, scanning the yard as if the grass itself might confess. The fence line bore a single smudge of mud exactly at the height of a human hand. Near it lay a piece of candy wrapped in red foil. Elena bent down, picked it up with gloved fingers, and sealed it in another bag. The wrapper gleamed like a drop of blood. Inside, Jonah told her what Theo had mentioned a few nights earlier, a man with a leather jacket and a pale mark on his neck who sometimes came by the greenhouse. He had given Theo candy, smiling with a softness that hid its edges. Theo had never been afraid of the man, only of what happened after he left. Elena felt the puzzle tighten in her mind. She knew that description. Everyone on the force did. Silas Cross, a name that moved through the underbelly of Cedar Ridge like a current you couldn't see but always felt. Small-time trafficker recruiter of the desperate. Rumors said he ran his operations out of an abandoned repair shop on the edge of town, a place where the light never reached the corners. He had been quiet lately. Too quiet, Elena thought. Later, in a sterile federal office, a different truth surfaced. Ryan Lane. Theo's father sat in a folding chair while a federal agent read notes from a file. Ryan's history spilled out in flat words: transport runs, cash handoffs, routes chosen to avoid cameras. He had been a runner once for Silas, but he'd tried to leave. You didn't leave men like Silas clean. Ryan had been attending rehab, rebuilding his body and will, but now his past had followed him home. The threat in that letter wasn't only for Theo, it was a leash tugging Ryan back into silence. By evening, Elena had ordered extra patrols around the Patel house. Jonah installed a second security camera and replaced the porch light bulb with a brighter one that hummed like a trapped bee. Avery rearranged the furniture so Theo's play area was away from windows. None of them told Theo why. Children know without knowing. He began carrying the fox-shaped flashlight everywhere, even during the day, even to breakfast. It wasn't light he needed, but proof that light could follow him. At CPS, a meeting of clipped voices and paper shuffling decided Theo's future. Some officials wanted him moved to a secure location. Kendra Alvarez, worn but resolute, weighed Elena's field reports against the legal arguments. Every move we make rewrites this child's present. Elena said quietly, the words almost swallowed by the room. He's already lost a past we can't give back. "Don't take this from him, too." Naomi Brooks sent over the audio of Theo's original call. When they played it, the room shifted. Between the boys' words, the 2.4 seconds of silence seemed to hold more truth than the sentences themselves. Fear was audible in that pause, and hope too. No one argued after that. Kendra ruled Theo would stay where he was. Stability over procedure. Continuity over caution. But stability is fragile. One evening, Theo overheard fragments of conversation he wasn't meant to hear. Voices about moving him, keeping him safe, making hard choices. The words folded into each other until they sounded like the creak of a rope about to snap. That night, while Avery prepared dinner and Jonah fixed a loose hinge, Theo slipped out the back door. The sky had turned the color of unripe plums, storm clouds massing over the ridge. A cold rain began thin as needles. Theo ran through the field, clutching the foxlight against his chest. He didn't know exactly where he was going, only that he had to go before someone sent him away again. Behind him, the house glowed like a lantern he couldn't carry. When Avery discovered he was gone, panic surged like electricity. She called Elena, who was already on patrol nearby. Within minutes, searchlights carved the dark, cutting through rain and shadow. The wind howled turbines groaning like giants in pain. Elena found the first clue at the edge of the woods, small footprints pressed deep into the mud toes, splayed running without direction. She followed them into the trees. Her radio crackled with updates, but she barely heard them over the hammering of her own pulse. The storm made the forest strange, each branch a possible threat, each gust a whisper of danger. Then, faintly, she saw a golden dot of light bobbing near the base of a pine. The fox flashlight. Theo sat curled beneath the tree, soaked to the skin, shivering so hard his teeth made tiny clicks. Elena dropped to her knees beside him. She removed her body camera, clicked it off, and set it aside. "Theo," she said softly, almost like a lullaby, "you're safe now. I'm here." His lips trembled. "If they send me away, will you still come?" Elena wrapped her coat around him. "No one is sending you away," she promised. "You are staying, and I am staying too." For a moment, the storm seemed to hold its breath. Theo looked at her eyes wide and uncertain, and then after 2.4 seconds, he nodded. She carried him back through the rain, past the turbines whose blades now turned like guardians rather than threats. Jonah and Avery ran to meet them, relief collapsing their voices into silence. Together they wrapped Theo in blankets and placed him near the fire, the foxlight glowing steadily beside him. That night, Avery and Jonah sat awake long after Theo slept. On the porch, Elena stood guard watching the street. In the distance, a truck idled with its lights off. A pale scar flashed briefly in the glow of a passing car before vanishing into dark. Somewhere out there, Silas Cross was waiting. If you're moved by this story and want to hear how it unfolds, please subscribe now. Your support helps keep these voices alive and these stories heard. The days that followed the storm carried a tension so sharp it seemed to hum beneath the skin of Cedar Ridge. Though the rain had passed, its memory lingered in puddles that reflected the sky like broken mirrors. The Patel house smelled of damp wool and scorched coffee. Every surface seemed to hold its breath, as if one wrong movement might shatter the fragile illusion of safety they had fought so hard to keep. Theo slept but uneasily. Even in dreams, his hands curled around the fox-shaped flashlight as if light itself were a promise he had to grip to keep from vanishing. Avery and Jonah barely left his side. They spoke to one another in whispers, not because he might wake, but because the walls felt too thin for normal voices. Elsewhere, decisions were being forced into motion. Ryan Lane sat alone in a windowless room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. The federal agent across from him wore the expression of someone who had seen too many bargains struck and too many lives wrecked by the wrong signature. A single document lay on the table between them, its edges crisp, its language cold and precise. "This is your chance," the agent said, his voice even. "Testify against Silas Cross. Give us names, locations, dates. In return, we protect you and your son." Ryan stared at the paper. His hands trembled slightly, though he kept them flat on the table to hide the tremor. Memories pressed against him like unwelcome guests' nights when he had driven the back roads with packages he wasn't allowed to open, the smell of leather and gasoline, the sound of Silas's voice when he'd tried to quit. "No one leaves clean," Silas had said. "You either stay or you disappear." He thought of Theo, of the boy's silence on the phone, of the 2.4 seconds between breaths that carried both terror and hope. He thought of the letter, "If he talks, the boy disappears." His own fear was irrelevant. Theo's life was not. Ryan picked up the pen. "My name doesn't need protecting," he said, his voice rough. "My son does." The signature came out shaky, but final. A decision sealed. Across town, Melissa sat in the circle of a therapy group. The room was plain folding chairs, a pot of lukewarm tea on a table in the corner, but to her it felt like a confessional. For weeks she had avoided speaking about the child she had lost as a teenager, the one her parents had forced her to give up, the silence that had carved itself into her bones. Tonight she spoke. "They told me to sign the papers and forget," she said quietly, as if forgetting was something you could do on command. Her voice faltered, then steadied. "When Theo was born, I thought maybe I could erase the first mistake by holding on to him so tightly nothing could take him away. But I was wrong. Love isn't holding on until you both can't breathe. Love is letting go when it's the only way to keep someone safe." When the session ended, Melissa stayed seated for a moment longer, staring at her hands. In the morning, she would speak to Kendra Alvarez and tell her she would not contest Theo's placement. For now, she let the decision sit like a stone in her chest, heavy but solely. Two events moved forward on the same day, though neither knew of the other's exact timing. At the CPS building, the hearing room filled with officials' papers and the sound of pens tapping nervously against clipboards. Avery and Jonah sat close together, hands entwined. Elena stood behind them, a silent figure in uniform, watchful but unyielding. Across town, at an abandoned repair shop, law enforcement officers surrounded the building in silence. Their radios crackled softly as they moved into position. Silas Cross was inside, unaware that his circle of control was about to collapse. The room felt too bright, the overhead lights harsh and clinical. Kendra Alvarez began by summarizing the case. Theo's rescue, his progress in foster care, the threat posed by Silas and his associates. Her words were steady, but her eyes betrayed the weight of them. A state attorney rose to speak, arguing for procedure for the rights of biological parents to be given another chance. "We must consider family reunification," he said. "Fear alone cannot dictate policy." Avery's hands tightened on Jonah's. Her lips pressed together, holding back words like a dam straining against floodwater. At the same moment, Elena's team advanced. Boots whispered against broken concrete. The repair shop loomed ahead, its windows dark, its door ajar. Inside, Silas paced, phone in hand. He was a tall shape, wrapped in shadow, the pale scar across his throat catching a glint of light like a blade. "Unit 2, ready?" a voice murmured through Elena's earpiece. She inhaled, then signaled. The door burst open. Commands shouted. Movement like a storm. Silas froze, his phone slipping from his fingers. His eyes met Elena's across the room. There was no fear there, only recognition. "You think I'm a monster?" he said, almost conversationally. "But I was a kid once, too. I called for help. No one answered." Elena's reply was simple. "I'm answering now." The cuffs clicked shut. Back in the hearing, Naomi's audio played Theo's original call, his trembling request for a happy meal. The 2.4 seconds of silence filled the room like a held breath. It was not empty. It was everything the sound of survival balanced on the edge of hope. When the clip ended, the room stayed still for a long moment. Even the attorney who had argued for procedure seemed unable to meet anyone's eyes. Kendra's voice broke the silence. "Theo Lane will remain with the Patel family. His biological parents will have supervised visitation only. Stability must be our priority." Avery exhaled, tears blurring her vision. Jonah's hand tightened around hers. Later that same day, Ryan testified before a panel of federal agents. His voice was steady, each word a nail, sealing Silas's fate. As he spoke, images of Theo floated in his mind, the boy's thin shoulders, his quiet rituals, the way he clutched the fox light as if it were a star that belonged only to him. When Ryan finished, he lowered his head. He had no illusions. His testimony would sever him from everything he had once been, including people who still thought of him as family. But Theo's future was worth the loss. By nightfall, both paths had converged into a fragile victory. Silas was in custody. The hearing had secured Theo's place with Avery and Jonah, but the cost of these outcomes clung to everyone like smoke after a fire. Elena drove past the Patel house on her way home. She saw the porch light glowing softly, and through the window, Theo asleep beneath a blanket, the fox light glowing beside him. She slowed the cruiser for a moment, then continued on. Inside, Avery and Jonah sat in silence, listening to the rhythmic hum of the turbines on the ridge. For the first time in weeks, the sound felt less like a warning and more like a promise kept. If you've been following Theo's journey and want to hear the final chapter, please subscribe now. These stories are stronger when we experience them together. The storm passed, but its memory lingered like a scar beneath the skin of Cedar Ridge. In the days that followed Silas Cross's arrest, the town moved as if waking from a bad dream. Windows were opened again. Curtains were drawn back. People began to look at one another instead of past one another. But beneath this return to routine lay something quieter, harder to define, a collective breath slowly exhaled after weeks of holding it in. At the Patel house, life rearranged itself into patterns of safety. Theo slept through the night more often now, though the fox-shaped flashlight never left his side. Some mornings he woke before dawn and padded silently into the kitchen where Avery would be making tea. They would sit together without words, listening to the first birds declare themselves against the pale horizon. It was not happiness exactly, but it was a seed that might grow into happiness if tended carefully. Elena visited often, not always in uniform. Sometimes she brought groceries or a small bag of toys left unclaimed at the station. Sometimes she simply stood on the porch with Jonah watching the street, both of them listening for a silence that was finally becoming ordinary instead of ominous. The neighbors had started nodding when they passed, not curious now but protective, as if they had all been entrusted with a secret they meant to keep safe. Naomi Brooks stayed late at the dispatch center drafting new protocols inspired by Theo's call. She titled the document, "Listening for the Unsaid." She trained new dispatchers to hear not just words but the spaces between them, the breath held too long, the pause heavy with meaning. She played Theo's call as an example, letting the 2.4 seconds of silence echo through the room until every trainee understood what it carried. Fear. Hope. A child balancing between both. The program spread. Soon, there were laminated posters in every kindergarten classroom showing children when and how to call for help. Beside the alphabet charts and weather calendars hung a simple message: your voice matters, even if it's small. The community began to knit itself together in other ways. A grocery store started a quiet voucher program for families in need, no forms, no questions. Church groups volunteered to read stories at shelters. Retired officers signed up to be part of a new coalition called Theo's Line, a network of people willing to listen, to look closer, to act sooner. It wasn't perfect. No system ever was. But it was motion, where there had been stillness, attention, where there had been neglect. The house on Sycamore Street did not survive. After Silas's arrest, the building was condemned and torn down. In its place rose a small park with a single young oak tree in the center. On opening day, there were no speeches, no cameras. Just neighbors gathering, some bringing food. Others only their presence. In the shade of the tree stood a bronze plaque that read, "Sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest messages." Listen. For Theo, the transformation was slow and private. He began to draw pictures that looked outward instead of inward. Instead of bridges leading nowhere, his paper cities now had roads that connected places where light could travel freely. He began to laugh, a sound rusty at first, then clear. At school, he made a friend by sharing an extra sandwich he had packed just in case. His teacher wrote in her notes, polite, thoughtful, watchful. Theo was still a child who measured the world carefully, but he no longer measured it only for danger. 3 years passed. On a bright April afternoon, the Patel house buzzed with the modest chaos of a birthday party. Streamers twisted on the porch rail, and a homemade cake sat on the table, its frosting imperfect but joyful. Theo, now 10, wore a paper crown askew on his head. He was taller, his eyes steadier, though still deeply observant. In his room were posters of Rocket's drawings of animals and a single photo taped to the wall. Elena, standing beside a younger version of himself, both smiling awkwardly beside a patrol car. The park where his old house once stood had grown green and full. The oak tree spread a wider shade, now its branches humming softly with spring wind. Families came there to picnic, to play, to sit on benches and watch their children run. One bench bore the bronze plaque, its surface polished by countless hands. Sometimes Theo liked to sit there with his sketch pad. He didn't draw the past anymore. He drew future cities with bridges that held birds that carried messages between clouds, lights that never flickered out. When asked what he remembered most about that night long ago, he would say only, "Someone picked up the phone." It was a simple sentence, but like the call itself, it contained more than anyone could see. On his 10th birthday, his two worlds came together. Melissa and Ryan arrived quietly, not as intruders, but as part of a circle. Melissa handed Avery a small envelope. Inside were photos of Theo over the years, moments he had been too young to hold in memory. His first tooth, lost his first day of school, the first time he smiled without checking to see if anyone was watching. Melissa's hands trembled, but her voice did not. "He still keeps your photo under his pillow," Avery said gently. Melissa closed her eyes and nodded. She had once believed that love meant possession. Now she knew it meant presence, even from a distance. Ryan knelt beside Theo, showing him a small whistle he had made from wood. "Only blow it in an emergency." He said, a faint smile touching his mouth. Theo nodded solemnly, understanding more than his father realized. As the sun dipped lower, Elena arrived. Theo ran to her, holding up the fox-shaped flashlight. "It still works," he announced. "But now I use it to find things, not to hide." Elena ruffled his hair, her throat tightening. She looked around at the gathered circle Patels. Lane's neighbors' teachers, and saw what survival could build when people refused to look away. That evening, as the party ended, Theo stood in the park beneath the oak tree. The turbines on the ridge turned slowly, their blades slicing the twilight. The wind carried a soft hum through the branches, steady and calm. Naomi, sitting on a nearby bench, opened her old logbook. She traced the entry from 3 years earlier, 2.4 seconds of silence. Sign of fear. Beneath it, she wrote a new line, 2.4 seconds, sign of peace. She closed the book and listened. The silence was full now, not hollow. Theo lifted the fox light, switched it on, and held it toward the sky. For a moment, the beam seemed to touch the turbines, the branches, even the clouds. A promise of light kept and carried forward. Sometimes heroes are not the ones who shout the loudest. They are the ones who listen, who answer, who stay. And sometimes the smallest voices change the world, one quiet call at a time. If Theo's story touched you, please subscribe to this channel. Together we can ensure no small voice goes unheard.